Welcome all to this event run by the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group, or ISDG, at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to host our first event as a research network at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities, also known as CRASSH. We are grateful to CRASSH and the Cambridge Heritage Research Center for their support of this group. The ISDG is a graduate student-led initiative started in 2019 with the objectives of 1, promoting scholarship by and about Indigenous peoples across disciplines and spaces to be a regular feature of the intellectual life of Cambridge, and 2, promoting the sharing and discussion of insights and ideas pertaining to Indigenous studies across peoples, disciplines, times, and geographies. Today's event is titled Accomplice, Ally, or Appropriator, Exploring Boundaries of Indigenous Scholarship, and it will be moderated by Dr. Tanja Hoffmann. Dr. Hoffmann is an archaeologist and cultural anthropologist whose research interests center upon the interplay between and among intangible and tangible cultural heritage, Indigenous rights, resource management, and economic development. For the past 25 years, Dr. Hoffmann has been privileged to work with and for a number of Indigenous communities in Western Canada. Much of her research has been guided by community priorities, and consequently, Dr. Hoffmann has experience designing and implementing projects ranging from archaeological excavations to social impact assessments. Dr. Hoffmann is currently the postdoctoral research lead on a national project entitled Benchmarking Indigenous/Non-Indigenous Employment, Business, and Social Development Partnership Capacities in Major Resource Projects. The project is coordinated through Indigenous Works, a Canadian nonprofit Indigenous organization, MITAX, and the University of Saskatchewan's Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. Welcome, Dr. Hoffmann. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So welcome, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this panel. But before we begin the main event, there are just a couple of housekeeping points. So first of all, you'll note the event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind and keep your cameras on or off as you prefer. By remaining in the room as we record the meeting, you consent to be recorded. The recording will be available on the CRASSH website and on the ISDG Cambridge YouTube channel shortly after this event. You'll also note that everyone's mics are muted. During the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the moderator or to the general chat to let me know. I'll inform you when it's your turn to unmute your mic and ask your question, or you can simply write your question in the chat and I'll read it aloud to the speakers for you. Captioning has been enabled for this event. If you would like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen. Please note the captions are provided by Zoom and CRASSH, and CRASSH cannot be held responsible for the accuracy. We're also trialing this for the first time today, so please bear with us if it's not working. Rest assured, you'll be able to revisit the event recording on YouTube. We're doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event, so it goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and attendees throughout the event. So now to the main event. So I will first introduce our panelists, then invite each of them to make an opening statement if they so desire. I'll then open up for a discussion amongst the panelists for about 45 minutes, and then that'll be followed by a question and answer session. So to our esteemed panelists. So first I'd like to introduce Dr. Constance Khupe. Constance is a lecturer in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Constance's interests and publications are in Indigenous knowledge systems and in decolonizing education and research methodology in the African context. Unlike Western knowledge and government systems, which often ignore, marginalize, or render invisible Indigenous knowledge, Constance's work shows that Indigenous knowledge systems are in fact key to the survival of the very communities with which educational researchers and practitioners are required to critically engage. Constance advocates explicit recognition of participants' cultures, languages, and worldviews as a fundamental step in the process of decolonizing research methods. We then move on to Dr. Clifford Atleo. Cliff is a Chimchan and Nuchano scholar based in Vancouver, Canada, who teaches Indigenous governance, political economy, and resource relationships. He looks at how Indigenous communities navigate, adopt, resist mainstream capitalism while working to sustain their unique cultural identities, practices, and worldviews. Cliff is particularly interested in how Indigenous communities continue to assert agency within and sometimes outside the confines of settler colonial policies and economies. He's also interested in the revival of traditional economic practices, as well as the exploration of new practices rooted in traditional Indigenous principles and values. His current research looks at decision-making in Indigenous communities and a number of resource sectors, including energy, fisheries, forestry, and mining. So then we turn to Dr. Gabriela Ramos. She is a senior lecturer in the Latin American history at the Department of History and is also the director of the Center of Latin American Studies, both of which are at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Ramos is a social and cultural historian of Latin America, particularly the Andean region. She is born in Lima, Peru, and obtained her BA from Catholic University, Peru, an MA from Columbia in New York, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Her recent work, resulting in an award-winning book, is on death and religious conversion in the Andes. She has additionally been recently engaged in countering plans to build an airport near the famous World Heritage Site of Machu Picchu. And then finally, we have Dr. Rick Colbourne. Dr. Colbourne is an Algonquin Anishinaabe, and he is the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusive Communities and an Assistant Professor of Indigenous Leadership and Management at Sprott School of Business in Carleton University, which is located in Ottawa, Canada. He is an alumnus of the University of Cambridge, having obtained his PhD at the Judge Business School. His various collaborative projects and teaching engagements are concerned with Indigenous entrepreneurship and economic development. He is particularly interested in creating more positive engagement and relationships between Indigenous peoples and the political and business landscapes they work within. So very, very warm welcome to all four of you, and thank you for coming today. So before I ask that each of the panelists to kind of make an opening comment, I thought I'd just briefly look at some of the ways in which we actually came to deciding on the theme for this particular panel. So this panel rose out of two intersecting conversations. The first one is frequently brought forth by students who really want to do community-based work or work on issues related to specific communities, particularly how do we engage with Indigenous communities in an ethical way? And moreover, how do we engage in ethical research? The second conversation arose from a blog post entitled Accomplices, Not Allies, Abolishing the Ally Industrial Complex. So while most of us who work with and for Indigenous communities have engaged in many conversations about what constitutes cultural appropriation within the context of our own research, the blog by Indigenous Action takes aim at a growing cohort of quote unquote allied scholars, suggesting that the emergence of the ally industrial complex serves only to support activists whose career depend on the issues they work to address. And they contend that the term ally has in fact been rendered ineffective and meaningless. In response, the blog posters propose a new term, that of accomplice. So according to their definition, accomplices work to restore Indigenous identity, seeking acts of decolonization through their research. And to quote the blog post, the work of an accomplice in anti-colonial struggle is to attack colonial structures and ideas, end quote. Finally, to this discussion, we also add the idea of appropriator, defined here as someone who takes for his or her use something that isn't theirs. So through this panel, we hope to explore these definitions and the tensions they introduce and the opportunities they present. I'd like now to invite the panelists to make an opening statement, and then we will have a discussion going from there. So Constance, would you like to start us off?
Yes, sure. Thank you, and good evening to everyone. It's evening on my side, and greetings from South Africa. Thank you for having me on this discussion and conversation around the involvement of researchers within Indigenous communities, looking at whether they act as accomplices, allies, or appropriators of knowledge in the areas where they are. My take on this comes from the historical association of research, especially research among Indigenous peoples, with methods and perspectives that are aligned with the way colonialism happened within these spaces. And a lot of research that happened following colonial conquest was quite from the perspective of the researchers. So they would get in, observe, take what they thought was useful to them and interpreted things from their perspective. And sometimes coming in for very brief periods, but making very generalized statements around lives of Indigenous peoples. And that sort of line of thinking persists today because within the academy, research continues to happen along Western lines and along Western principles. And so looking at how the Indigenous Action Group, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the group quite well. Looking at how they define accomplice, ally, and so on, it also continues from along the same perspective that sometimes from a more liberal perspective, there are groups of people, including researchers, who get into communities with ideas about what communities might need, with their own interpretations about what should be happening within communities, and without necessarily taking the perspective of the communities themselves. And as a result, they then they seem to be advocating for a better livelihood for Indigenous peoples, but may not be representative of the Indigenous peoples. And it does happen sometimes in research because we come from powerful research institutions, and so our ideas, we seem to be thinking that our ideas should be what should take the day. And sometimes we forget about the ethics around carrying out research within these communities, especially the more marginalized communities. We take ethics as an event where the university grants ethics clearance, and we don't take it as an ongoing consideration, as an ongoing thought process throughout the research and even beyond the research process itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constance. Cliff?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. I have 3 Indigenous names. Both my parents are from the west coast of British Columbia here. My father's New Channel from a community called Ahousaht, and they're traditionally a whaling peoples, some of the few coastal peoples to hunt for whales on North America. And I carry the name Chacha Musni from that community, from the House of Clockish Beef, which means the house of whale fat. And on my mother's side, I'm Tsimshian, and I have two names, Nis Naya and Gamayam. And that's from the house of Nis Haiwas. And the reason I bring that up is I don't necessarily expect you to remember that or even know how to say it, but they introduce a different mode of accountability for me. So I have different responsibilities, and you know, when an elder will ask me, for example, who I am, the way they phrase it often is, who do you belong to? They'll say, who do you belong to? And I explain who my parents are, who my grandparents are. And even with that fairly brief explanation, they have a sense. I've situated myself for them, and they know my family and my family history in many ways. So when conducting research in the university setting, it's always quite challenging. I always tell my students that conducting ethical research in Indigenous communities or with Indigenous communities is at least twice as much work in terms of managing and navigating those relationships, putting in the time and the effort with respect and reciprocity, and also being accountable to a different relationship than the one we have perhaps with the university. One of the interesting experiences I had as a PhD student, for example, was writing about the potlatch, or this particular West Coast ceremony. And I was presenting about it to a group of graduate students at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. And this one particular student, he was a historian, and he took exception about he read my paper, and then in my talk, he felt that I didn't properly cite the potlatch. And to me, I thought that was ridiculous, because I come from a potlatching people. I've participated, I've sung, I've done dances for chiefs. And so I guess in an academic vernacular, I was using autoethnography. You know, I'm not a methodology expert myself, but I, come up with this term that describes what I was doing. And then on a personal side, I was kind of insulted that this white dude from Connecticut was giving me a hard time for not properly citing. So you come into these particular conflicts, and even during my PhD defense, I was required to go back in my revisions and find all sorts of citations, basically from old dead white guys like Boaz and others, like having to go back and to the satisfaction of the university to add these citations from people. And so yeah, I just wanted to share that very briefly, that when conducting research, even if you're not Indigenous, you do establish these relationships with these communities, you are opening up another avenue of accountability and reciprocity with a different paradigm, a different way of looking at the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gabriela?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for the invitation. Well, I want to say I'm a historian. I'm coming from not only a different field, but also from a different part of the world that has obviously a different history. And well, I specialized in the period following the Spanish conquest. So that is the 16th century. I'm interested in knowing and understanding precisely that process of transition from the pre-Columbian world to the colonial one, to the world that was created by both Spanish and indigenous people of different origins in the Andean area in particular. And so I, as a historian working on the 16th and 17th century, I do not interact with living people in my own research. So that is for some a disadvantage, because, well, of course, it's impossible to retrieve the world as it was. Even I think historians like myself that work on that period, we are aware that even if we work very hard in order to understand that world, it will never come to us as it was. And the other thing is also that, well, since I do not interact with living people, then to an extent that also means a certain responsibility, because I mean, there is the opportunity, of course, to say, I mean, I have the final say on what I study, but I think there is a degree there of responsibility in terms of trying to get as much, I mean, to research seriously as much as possible in order to understand that world and get to know the significance of what happened during those years. So that gives us, in a sense, a lot of power, I think, to historians, because, you know, no one is going to come and say, well, it wasn't like that. They are all dead. And on the other hand is also a weakness, because, as I said, we cannot retrieve that world. We can hear once in a while the voices of people in the documents, or when we visit places, we go and see, in my own work, this is what I've done, go to archaeological sites. I always like to see the places that I study, to have a sense of the world in which the people whose history I study, the world in which they inhabited. My main preoccupation, I think, is to try precisely to understand this process of change, of transformation. As a historian, this is what we study, no? How change took place in a given place among different people. And so this is where I always try to put the emphasis. For example, knowing that what we call an indigenous person today is not the same thing as it was, let's say, in the 16th or the 15th century. It's a constant process of transformation that people went through. There wasn't something like an Indian or an indigenous person. There were different people, different nations that lived according to the different contexts in which they were. And so I think that preoccupation for that constant change is something that I have in mind, and perhaps this is also something that puts me, in addition, aside to the other people, the other colleagues that are taking part of the panel today, because I deal with a different type of, let's say, set of questions and a different world as well. These issues of well, allies or appropriation are seen differently by historians. In the colonial, Andean colonial world, people had to count on a number of allies. They also had a number of enemies. They fought against each other. They had people both in the so-called New World, as well as the first migrants to Europe, that also became allies. And sometimes, well, if you use the language of the, I mean, that we are using for the panel today, also accomplices. So, and people were constantly changing, no? So they could be one thing one day, and they could be something different the next, according to the very difficult, very often very difficult circumstances in which they had to live and in order to survive. And this whole question of appropriation is also a very important and interesting topic in historical studies, because there was appropriation on both sides. People were, for example, very keen on learning how to read and write, because they knew that the power of the written document was so important in order to make sure that they could keep their land and many other properties. And on the other side, there was also quite an interest in learning about things. It was not seen in the terms as, for instance, well, contemporary scholars or activists see. So I think I have already talked a lot, but I wanted to stress the fact that I am, I think, standing in a kind of a different place here, and perhaps that could be of any use during the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabriela. Rick? Have we got Rick?
So Khupe, hello, bonjour. I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming from the unceded traditional territories of the Algonquin people, which is around the Ottawa Valley. So I'm in Ottawa. I guess where when I think about this, I think about my own journey in academia. And when I started, I felt very much of being an activist. I had to say the things that were uncomfortable. I had to push a lot. And then in Canada, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happened and there were some changes in those calls to action, what I see is there's been a bit of a shift towards more advocacy. So less of this kind of conflict or pushing and much more of a willingness to think about how do we start to engage and how do we do that. I come from a family that was illiterate. My parents didn't finish high school. So that informs everything that I do, because it means that I'm always thinking about that impact. How are we going to impact the socioeconomic health and well-being of our communities? One of the foundations for me is that I see that business schools and universities were complicit in colonization. And so that means that how do we start to tear those walls down? How do we start to engage in community engagement? How do we start to do Indigenous-led or community-based research in a way that starts to pull those walls down, in a way that starts to disrupt the university? And I do it from within, because it's a place that we can do something and have impact on communities. We can have impact in terms of changing the way that our students and future researchers are seeing or are experiencing Indigenous issues and challenges and engaging with those things. So that's kind of where I come to from it. And it's hard work. The other side is what we're trying to do is kind of switch the paradigm on the research side, because a lot of research funding agencies are uncomfortable with community-led or Indigenous-led research projects, in the sense that sometimes when we're co-creating or we're co-generating, it's really hard for us to be specific, because we're not imposing a perspective, we're not imposing a project. And so from a research funding perspective, that can be very difficult as well. So there's complexity here. In the work that we do, from my experience, there's affect, there's emotion, there's everything. And as Cliff said, it takes time. It takes much more time. You have to think about how research is mutually beneficial. I think about it in terms of self-determination, sovereignty, and how do we make sure that what we're doing promotes that and supports that. And then also have to engage with faculty who do not support this. Faculty who think that when we're doing work that promotes sovereignty, self-determination for communities and self-governance, that is in some way illegitimate work, or that's not the kind of work that we should be doing, or our research should not be addressing that. So there's complexity, there's a lot of dynamics around that, but from my perspective and my experience, we can have impact. We have impact on the everyday lived experience of community members, and the more that we can do that, the better. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. That's very interesting. So I thought I would just open the floor now to some discussion amongst our panelists, and perhaps maybe something to start everyone off with is a theme that's running through this whole conversation is around community-based research. And so I'm wondering, perhaps you could reflect on your own research processes a little bit more, and interactions with community around some of the essential steps that you feel are really necessary to doing community-based work. So anybody want to start us off?
I guess
I may.
Okay, go ahead. You go ahead, Constance.
All right, thank you. So my starting point would be when I thought of engaging the community, I first went in as someone who already had, I grew up in rural areas, and rural areas in Southern Africa and perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa mean you are on the margins, they mean poverty, they mean inadequate resources as resources are measured in today's world. So rural generally means disadvantage, but rural also means that is the space where the cultural life of indigenous peoples is still quite alive. It means the worldview of the people within these areas is not necessarily aligned to the Western worldview, which forms the basis of much of our research. So I grew up in rural areas. I worked in rural areas for quite a number of years. And so when it was time for me to do my doctoral research, which is what I'm going to be talking about, I thought I would not be able to adequately engage unless I use my own growing up as a foundation with which to engage with the community. So I looked back at some of the practices that I saw the elders in our communities do, like if someone is coming in, maybe a stranger passes by the village, that situation has to be reported to the chief or to someone who is in charge, so that it's known that the person should be welcomed. And so the reason why I'm saying all these things is that at university level, we apply for ethics clearance, no harm to the community according to university definitions of harm. And if your project is passed, then you are granted clearance and you have the right, according to the university, to get into the community. And it's almost as if that community has no say over receiving you as a researcher. It's as if once you get university clearance, then you have access, or then you are entitled, almost in a sense. So there was a negotiated access in terms of how we went around it. So the formal access was from the university and from the Department of Education, because this was an education research. But then getting into the community, there was need to negotiate access within the community. And we used the community structures that were there, including local municipal structures, to get into the community, request to see the local chief, and request access to the school, which was cited within the community. So there were layers of negotiations for access, and that in itself takes time. And apart from that negotiation of access, ethics also became a continuous process. So it wasn't the event of the ethics committee making a decision. It became a continuous process throughout the research, in the different meetings, in the different things that we would need to do, negotiate with the community, what would be right for them, what might not be right for them. In that context as well, there are no written protocols, which is the case in some among some indigenous peoples. I think like in Australia and perhaps in New Zealand as well. I'm not sure what the case looks like in Canada. So in Africa, there are generally no written protocols around doing research. But the absence of any written protocol does not mean that there are no protocols. So as a researcher going within this community, you need to find out, who do I speak to, who can give me information? And part of what I did as well was to identify some young people who volunteered to help me, and I would consult regarding what is the culturally appropriate way of approaching this, or what is the most culturally appropriate way of approaching this particular issue. Is it something that we can discuss? Is it something that we must not discuss? And so there are different layers within which we can approach that subject, so that we don't take our own agenda as that which is a primary and not take into consideration the agenda of the community. And sometimes the agenda of the community is way out of our research questions, which mean also that we may need to be very flexible in the way in which we plan. We need to be fluid and accommodate and allow those conversations to go on, because they are the conversations that probably help us to anchor our findings much more, because those findings don't happen in a vacuum. They happen within a cultural context, a socio-economic context, sometimes a socio-political context, and that understanding helps us to understand the findings that we get. And the findings may also go beyond those that answer our research questions. The findings may include the research process itself as part of the findings of that whole journey. And finally, I think my final point on this one would be the issue of language. In the African context, many of the rural communities will not be able to speak a European language, and sometimes even if they are able to, it's considered disrespectful to speak to them in English or Afrikaans or French or other European-based language. So it also means decisions have to be taken around how to engage in a respectful manner with this community, and in a way that will allow their own processes to unfold as part of that research. That makes the community more involved, and allowing ourselves also as researchers to acknowledge our own identity. I may be an African woman doing research in an African village, but I'm not necessarily an insider within that village. So sometimes I'm an insider, outsider. Sometimes I'm a complete outsider, because like in the case where I was, I didn't even adequately speak the language. And I came from a completely different country. And so even though I'm Black and would relate with a whole lot of cultural processes, but there are nuances that I needed to be mindful about throughout that research process. So that engagement is allowing the research to unfold, not in the strict timelines which our throughput-driven universities often follow, but in a way that is accommodating of community processes and the community context. Thank you.
Thank you, Constance. Rick, do you want to follow up on that?
Oh, I think that represents a lot of commonalities in our experience in Canada and some of the work that we do around gaining trust, developing trust. But, you know, I think the other side is you need to think of projects that from my perspective, these are just not in and out projects. If you commit to working with the community and doing research with the community, that's usually a long-term commitment. You're committing to being there. And the other implication is that there are tangible and intangible aspects of the work that we do with communities. The tangible ones are sometimes the work that we're doing in community, the research that we're working on together, the co-generation, the co-creation, but there are also intangible pieces around building trust, making sure that what we're doing is mutually beneficial, providing support, providing other kind of resources that support community efforts. And so I think a lot of time in this, you know, when we're thinking about sort of Western approaches to research and colleagues in particularly in business schools, it's very much in and out, and not always around taking a long-term view that we're here to be a part of the journey with the community and to help and to work together on things. And then the whole idea that there's a lot of hidden work that you don't see that is an important part of the work that we do with community to support that, all of our efforts to make sure that it's mutually beneficial, to make sure that it's working, to continue that dialogue and to continue that co-creation process and that journey, and to commit to a more longer term view.
Thanks, Rick. Anybody else have something to add to that?
Thanks, Tanya. I just briefly wanted to say a couple things that I find challenging and interesting. So my department, the Resource and Environmental Management School here, is interdisciplinary. So my colleagues are not all in the same area as me. Even the other social scientists, they might focus on other things like economics. But also I work with ecologists, wildlife people studying avalanches, fisheries, forestry. And one of the interesting challenges that I've found is them coming from a particular perspective on replicability, like their methodology. And when I work in certain Indigenous communities, I would hazard that it is almost impossible to replicate exactly what I'm doing or what somebody else is doing. There's just no way to, there's too much dynamic fluidity to try and actually do that. So I try to address some of those issues by declaring, I mentioned before about positionality and self-location, declaring what my biases are and my perspective, and the idea of a sort of insider-outsider that Constance mentioned also really resonates with me, because some communities I'm quite close with and some communities I'm not. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was around research ethics protocols. In Canada, we also have a fairly robust research ethics process for doing research. And I think it has come a long way in the last 10 years or so. But one of the weirdest experiences I had was researching fisheries in my home communities. And I remember sitting with my aunt. She was married to my dad's younger brother, and I wanted to get her perspective as an Indigenous woman on fisheries, in particular because a lot of the informants in these realms are usually men, and I wanted to sort of talk to equally both men and women. But the most uncomfortable experience I had in research was when I was pretty young at the time. I remember sliding across this 3-page ethics, consent form, right? And it talks about confidentiality. And I just remember, like, I don't think I can relate to you, but the look that she gave me was like, what on earth are you doing, nephew? And so the irony of it is I basically ended up having to relate to her as a nephew aunt again and saying, listen, auntie, the university make me do this. I have to do this to get, to do this work. And essentially it says that I will not, take advantage of you, or you have final say on how it comes out and what I say and so forth. So, on the one hand, from a perspective, I acted unethically from the university's point of view by not carefully reading every single thing out. but I just couldn't overcome that initial distrust of me pushing paper and asking her to sign something. So automatically it actually introduced a level of distrust, and it damaged that relationship a little bit. And I had to talk my way and overcome it and just sort of relate to her in a different way, relate to her in that sort of university, right? Which I found really interesting. And so and then in other experiences, they have improved a lot, and you can do verbal consent, and there are processes to be more natural, I guess, and still sort of have the same outcomes. But I really that look that she gave me was something seared into my memory, and not one I want to encounter again.
Thanks so much, Cliff. Gabriela, I'm going to be a little bit naughty and ask you a direct question, because I think just coming off of some of the conversations you and I've had, and then what Cliff has just said. So as a historian, do you feel there's a responsibility to the descendants of those who created the records that you study? And if so, do those descendants then impact your research design or historical research in any real meaningful way, in your opinion?
Definitely there is a responsibility, even if we don't, most of us do not know or have any connection with the people that we study. I don't know, I don't know how to go far back to my grandparents. I don't know who were the ones that came before them, and this is not unique. Most people do not know. Unless you are from some, belong to some elite class, it's very difficult that you can name. But I was thinking of an example I could give, since the other colleagues have talked about this question of ethics, which I think is definitely very important, and wanted to mention something about my experience as a historian. And rather than say, well, this is how I went about it, perhaps leave the question if anyone would like to consider it or discuss it. Some years ago, I was involved in a project to recover the materials related to, parish books, parish records. Peru is a country that was, together with the Spanish colonizers, the Catholic Church also went. So this is a country that is mostly Catholic. And so the church was very much part of the life of most of the people. And at least for the period that I study, without the records, without all the information collected by the church, it would be almost impossible to learn about the history of the different people that live in the region. And I was involved in this project. Well, more than involved, I started it and directed it, and it was to recuperate these parish records in an area of the country that is not that far away from the capital of Peru, Lima. Because, well, during a couple of decades, the country was in a very difficult situation due to a civil war, and different small towns, villages suffered because of the violence. And in some instances, the local archives and the parish archives were actually, they were suffering the threat of losing these materials. So we thought that it would be necessary to collect these records and digitize them in order to make sure that they would not be lost. And so, there was this work which I didn't do myself, but people from the team based in the place, they went and visited these villages. They talked with the people in order to collect the originals and then digitized, and some of the originals actually stayed in the archive, in the church archives. And so I was, the materials were saved. No, now they are digitized and people can see them on. I mean, they are online, etc., etc. And when we at the end of the project, when we met with the people, representatives of the different towns and villages that had given their papers. We talked about that, and because of, and this is something probably that most of you will understand very well, because we have this idea of history that is only about famous people, no, the heroes, rich people, important people, etc., etc. And very often, well, people say, well, but that is a history. I mean, that's a history that perhaps we do not take part of that. So the opportunity to have all these materials that we have gathered, even if it's only parish records, because sometimes in a baptism record or a marriage record or a death record, there is so much about the history of, common people like you and me, like, anyone. And so it was interesting because they haven't thought about history in that form, that these records could have something about their history. No? So it was quite interesting to move from this very traditional type of historical understanding and historical reading to the idea that these papers were actually, I mean, they spoke about, I mean, they were about their ancestors, even if they didn't know exactly who they were, because people have changed names. Many people were given Spanish surnames. It's a very complex and fascinating history, also this whole issue of naming. And so the question I think I will leave is, well, do you think that the procedure was ethical? Because the people were convinced to say, well, give us your papers. They are going to be better kept in the archive. Whenever you go there, they will be there. They are also available online. At the time, people still were keeping files on CDs. They had access to that, but if there was another situation as the one so many people went through, that they would see their archives destroyed, all these many things either stolen or just eaten by the mice and the moths and everything. But now it was kept safely. No, so there are two sides to that. No, one is that this is safe and it's not going to be lost. The other is that the people had to be convinced that it was not, that they could give these registers to be taken in a centralized place. Sometimes in some places have to admit that there was some, not exactly resistance, but are you sure, these papers are still going to be ours? So that's I think a dilemma. It's a question. It's already done, but you can also think of what is the ethical side of that? Did we break it or did we make it? Thanks.
Thanks, Gabriela. Anybody like to respond to that? No? I think it's an excellent question, and certainly one I'm sure that will generate some discussion. And so I think what we'll do now is open up the floor to some questions. So if anybody has any questions, I'll remind you that you can put them into the chat, or I think there's an option to sort of raise your hand. I'm going to let the tech support on the other end here help me out with all of this. So. Okay, so we have a question for Rick. So picking up on Dr. Colbourne's thoughts on the university as a colonial institution and Dr. Atleo's PhD experience, do the panelists have any thoughts on the politics of citation within the academy? How can citation be ethically deployed? What is the role of scholarly citation in being an accomplice? Does this extend beyond writing on quote unquote Indigenous topics? And this person's writing from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. Anybody would like to take that one?
I think that's a really tough one. What I'm trying to understand is, what are you asking, right? I think that when I cite, are we talking about citing community resources or community participants? So I guess if I'm working with community organizations or communities, sometimes what I'll try to do is co-write with community members, right? And try to engage them in writing. In terms of, and if we're interviewing, but the citation piece, so I'm kind of confused around kind of what is at the core of the question. Because a lot of times I'm going to be reporting on interviews, conversations, circles that are confidential and anonymous, and we anonymize all those materials. So maybe if you can kind of clarify what you mean on the citation, that might help, right? Clifford, I don't know, what are your thoughts?
I'm not sure. My perspective, like, how can citation be ethically deployed? I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but my experience has been, what is considered valid, valid knowledge, I guess. And in Canada, there's been this long history and debate about it in the courtrooms as well, where oral history was seen as valid testimony after Delagamuke, which was a big case in 1997. And so my own sort of personal battle has been trying to use a combination of contemporary oral history, so stories that my dad has told me, stories that he's heard and other relatives have heard passed down. And then I will often refer to historical texts, like, again, mostly by white anthropologists or ethnographers, and try to read both of these critically, and then come to my own sort of my own analysis. And I always qualify that with, this is my own particular analysis, this is who I am, my situation, and this is what I think. And it's not, take it how you will, and then consult others. This is kind of my response on that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think what I try to do is draw on Indigenous scholars wherever I can as the kind of the first stage. And then you're right, we're kind of always sort of trying to blend some of the traditional stories and some of that with what we're hearing. And it's hard to find primary resources, particularly if we're trying to go back and find those primary resources in the same way that you would go back and find primary resources from the Parliament of Canada from 1827, so there's challenges all around that. One of
the things that I've done that is a fairly set of unique circumstances, but in some of the ethnographies, the key informants or the sources, quote unquote, are named. And so although it makes it kind of onerous, in the text I will say Pierre cited in name of the ethnographer, so that the original citation actually goes to the individual who's given the information. And then you can sort of say hereafter cited as Pierre or whatever, and you can kind of co-opt the citation in order to give reference to the original source.
Yeah, I do something similar in that way as well.
Yeah. Okay, so somebody here else has said, I sit at the intersection of marginalized communities in the global north, but I'm planning to do co-creation, co-design work in Ghana, my place of heritage. I resonate with the insider-outsider phrase. I'm working at the intersection of technology, ecology, and sociology, with the former having much disdain / confusion about why this work is important, and at times undermining or invalidating the work. It was mentioned earlier that this is expected in interdisciplinary spaces, but how do you deal with these difficult interactions in more traditionally, quote unquote, scientific spaces? Cliff, do you want to, I think you were the one talking about that. Do you want to respond? Oh, your mic's muted, Cliff.
Sorry, I just got distracted for a second. If anyone else wants to jump in, I just want to read the question again.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Anybody working in really traditionally scientific or working with?
While Clifford's reading, I mean, one of the things that I look at, I'm working on transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary work, but I'm looking for people who share perspectives, who share values around engagement. And that's not always going to be the case, but I'm always sort of within the university, I'm looking at who are the scholars that are interested in this kind of work or would be open to trying to do different things that maybe push against the boundaries. And so part of what I'm always doing is looking at who's here, who wants to contribute, who wants to be a part of these things, and who's interested in putting the time into maybe creating, co-generating or co-creating different kinds of opportunities. So for me, that's part of what I do when I'm here, is to find out who those people are.
Thanks. Yeah, Rick, I was just going to say that, you know, sometimes I feel very finite about time and how much time I have now the older I get. I once heard a podcast where somebody was saying they calculated how many more books they could read. They were talking about fiction books, you know, for enjoyment. And the number was quite startling to them, like based on their average reading, they were only going to be able to read this many more books. So they started to think about it very carefully. Which ones do I want to read? I'm lucky that in my department, there are a number of traditional scientists or applied scientists, whatever the correct term is, that are open to other perspectives and other sort of valid ways of understanding the world. And I think that is where I tend to focus my time, and less so on trying to convince other people who are openly hostile to what it is that I'm doing. And unfortunately, sometimes you may find yourself in an environment that is pretty hostile to your perspective. And you know, I think there are a number of resources out there that have looked critically at science. And like I'm working on a paper right now for a science journal with other social scientists, and talking about the ways in which science is not objective. It is not free of bias, that it is replete and full. And I can't remember, I think Rick mentioned universities and their place in colonization is quite substantial. So I think sometimes you do have to fight, and then other times, like I said, I'm of the perspective that I don't have the energy to fight right now, and I'm going to work with who wants to work with me.
And I just want to follow up, because Jocelyn made that point about power, and I think that remember that we can choose the people that we want to work with, and that sometimes the hard decision is to walk away from opportunities because you know that it's not going to work, and it's not going to be. It may be that it's top-down driven, it's all about power, or it's driving the wrong kinds of agenda. And so in my career, I try to walk away from those things because they corner you. And I see that you're pre-PhD, you're young, then look for those academics who have open minds, who are open to sharing, because there are scholars in academia who are very much around power sharing with students and opening up to ideas, but you have to find them. You know, you have to engage and network and get out there and find out who are those scholars who are really open to working in that way and disrupting those power relationships.
Thank you very much. Gabriela, I had a kind of a question related to what you had just said around the project around the archives that's come from one of our students, and specifically around digitization of records. And is, in your experience in that case, was digitization the right way forward for democratizing access to those records? Did the communities actually end up accessing them? And is that something that you would do in future with other projects? And if so, why?
Well, I think the principle is that first, that we make sure that these records that hold the history of all these many people are not lost, are not destroyed, because they're simply not copies. These are all manuscripts. And by saving them and by putting them in a site where they are accessible, I think, well, at least ideally one can assume that they are being, the people can read them, can have access to their contents. Of course, the path between, as I said, this traditional historical thinking and history education to understanding that even if there are these little bits that tell something about common people that lived in all these places in the past, is you know, the path between one point and another is long and difficult, because very often people do not have all the motivation or all the understanding. I wish that there would be forms in which we could have, for example, workshops or some activities like the ones we organized, so that these people can have the possibility to see that that is something, I mean, that these are documents about their own past. So, but in between, of course, there's all these many obstacles, all these many structures, all these ways of thinking that do not allow for going from this point A to the point B more easily, no? Yeah, it's long and difficult to do this if you are, I mean, you don't have the power not to actually move things around. And if I can make just a little comment, because I think this is also related in part to what has just been discussed, the fact that some people can be more open to understanding the type of research that the other colleagues do, I think is perhaps not only sort of looking around for people that are sensitive, but perhaps also trying to do as much as possible so that the people that who choose fields that are within technology or engineering or know that all these people, when they are students, maybe beyond, that they can have access to an interest in the social sciences and the humanities. We are continuously sort of told that, you know, these other fields are more valuable and more interesting, and also they give more money or whatever. But I think this also shows the importance of continuing pressing for teaching the social sciences and the humanities. Is, I think, the only way that we can have more people being more understanding and more open to interact with scholars in other disciplines like ours, no?
Mm. Yes, excellent points. I think everybody would agree with that for sure. Constance, I just had a question that I think is really pertinent to the work that you do, especially your continuing work in education. And that question is, there's a prevailing notion that after graduating or publishing or running out of money, a research project ends, and it's often the norm to move on to something new. In your own work, when does research end, or does it end?
Yeah, thank you. That is a very important question. Because we started at the beginning by emphasizing the issue of establishing and building relationships with communities that we work with, and that relationship building, and when those relationships are established, sometimes they go on way beyond the life of the research project itself. And what I have seen is that the findings of a research project in terms of what would have been a researcher's or original research questions, the findings may perhaps they have a time frame within which they are valid, and perhaps other researchers take that up and extend the questions and expand and everything. But in terms of the way in which we would have gathered that information, I think that lives longer than the research findings. And certainly that has been my experience in that I did go into the community with perhaps quite poorly framed research questions, even though I was trying as much as possible to be sensitive and so on. But I also had the restrictions of what the university desired for me to have. And so that is what I went with in the community. And through the research project, I realized that one of my research questions was particularly quite badly framed, because I was asking, what aspects of Indigenous knowledge could be used in school science. So I was looking for bits that fit, which means I was already going in framed within a Western worldview. So saying to the community, this is a Western science is what we should all aspire to have. And so give us little bits of information that we could incorporate into Western science, which I don't think first is sensitive, and secondly is also a complete misunderstanding of what Indigenous knowledge systems are, because it becomes hard to break people's ways of lives and ways of understanding reality into bits that can fit within categories of subjects, categories of the subject disciplines in school. So it's something that I only learned at the end, but that learning lives longer than the actual finding. That's what I think, that the method, the way in which we approach a community may outlive the findings that we get. And my being here as part of this call is not because of the findings of my study. It's more how I did that study, which actually lives. And so in most of Indigenous research, I think we need to be thinking around that, around what will live longer. And I think the method lives longer, and that's how the relationships tend to last more. I still am in communication with some of the participants in the study, but I came out of that community at the end of 2013. So many years later, I'm still communicating with some of the people. So those relationships, if well established and well built, can actually continue and thrive.
Thank you. And I think it's a question, maybe this is something everyone can sort of speak to in our few minutes we have left. It's a question I frequently get from students here in Cambridge who are keen to do community-based research all over the world, but are very cognizant of the fact that they're in Cambridge, and also of sort of COVID constraints. And so I guess the question is it possible for, given the constraints, but is it possible or even appropriate using, Zoom and other methods to establish the kind of relationships that all of you have established and base your relation or your research upon, or not?
Maybe I can just continue from there. I said earlier on, for my context, that rural generally means poor. Rural means forgotten by government and by everyone in the city. And so connectivity is poor. Maybe even devices to do the research via Zoom would not even be possible. So even within a pandemic situation, and obviously resources have now been redirected perhaps more towards COVID research more than other social science research or any other research that would have been carried out within rural communities. I am not sure that in my context, for instance, that would be very successful from a resources perspective. And secondly, even from just the fact that a warm body is not the same as as the body that we see on the screen from most of the communities that I am aware of. That would be very difficult because now they are not sure who is recording, why are you recording, where is this going to be shared with. The trust will perhaps take much longer to build than it would if we were in a face-to-face situation. And funding, even outside of COVID, the university and other funding organizations are not always understanding of that bit of the need to build relationships. So they would prefer to, you fly in and you fly out, you have collected all your data and you're out. My own study initially, because of funding issues, was actually criticized for, why did you decide to go so far? Because it was a 7-hour road trip. And when I went, I needed to be there for at least 1 week because it's a long journey and all sorts of things. So they were saying when we say in your proposal, say if this study is plausible and doable, finance is part of what shows that it's not doable. So just go to the nearest township where there are indigenous people and ask them. So indigenous peoples in our context are also, while in other contexts they are over-researched, in ours, their voice is never heard because no one wants to actually go there. And no one is prepared to go there, from the funders to the researchers themselves.
I'll just jump in. So I agree with a lot that you were saying, Constance, but one way to kind of look at Zoom is a way to start those relationships, to start those engagement. And so I just look at the chat here where Jocelyn is connecting with the group here, and we've got Tanya and Jocelyn talking. These are how we start building trust and building relationships. And so right now we're kind of constrained, but I've come together with different groups. And so I'm not a fan of Zoom. I've been doing Zoom too much, but in our current situation, we may not be able to go face-to-face in the community, but we can start some of the dialogue. We can start some of these conversations. We can start sharing so that when we're ready to go into the community, that we've already come down that road a bit, And I think that events like this are a way to start. I mean, by having these conversations, we are creating a community. A community of practice. And these are ways that we can start to share and start to build trust with us and then with some of the work that we're doing. So I agree totally what you're saying, Constance, around those constraints and those issues. So.
Anybody else have thoughts on sort of you know, doing ethical research in sort of extreme geographies or by extreme distance anyway.
I have a question for Gabriela. I was just thinking in relation to the African context also, where the history is hardly, the history for indigenous peoples is orally passed on. And so there are hardly any written documents, say for the period that she is researching. I'm not sure what the situation is like in Peru, but the question is, to what extent do you perhaps sometimes feel conflicted about those written records, considering that they may have been written by so let's say by the settlers about indigenous peoples? To what extent do you find that sometimes conflicting?
Mm-hmm. All the time. Thank you very much for the question. This is something I insist a lot with the students that, for example, that take my paper on Latin American history for the initial period. I mean, like everything that relates to the pre-Columbian world that is not archaeology. How can we learn the history of the people of the Andes or Mexico or anywhere else before the arrival of the Europeans, if particularly in the Andes, they did have forms of recording different things, ideas, stories, things, but they were not in the form of the written European documents. So the fact that in order, for example, to know what was the conquest like, or the whole process of colonization, the organization of the colonial state, etc., we have to rely on documents, chronicles, etc., that were written by Spaniards. Not entirely, but a good part of that body of written documents was authored by Spanish priests, travelers, administrators, etc., etc. So that's a big problem. Historians of Spanish America have worked a lot in order to deal with, all the many filters, all the many problems involved with that. And so today, we have very fine scholars that have actually, grappled with that problem, learning indigenous languages and trying to approach how these languages were spoken back, let's say 400 years ago. Find archaeologists also that have sometimes confronted what the written record says with the archaeological record, or complementing. A lot of work has been done in order to precisely deal with this issue that you are mentioning. In my own work also, I have confronted, and this is an issue that, particularly if you are studying the history of the indigenous people of, in my case, my region or my country, you permanently have, what if, most people didn't have the opportunity to learn how to read and write. So they had to go to a notary that was sometimes Spanish, sometimes it was a mixed race person with interests, and using sometimes very bureaucratic formulas. So that's what we have. We have to use that type of material. But I would say, fortunately, a lot of, as I said, a lot of work and sort of other disciplines have come to our help in order to deal with that problem. At the same time, as I said at the very beginning, we are aware that it is impossible to retrieve that world, but we are doing as much as we can. Thank you very much for the question, because I really like that topic. Thanks.
That's great. Well, I think in the interests of time, we're almost out of it. And I just thought I'd wrap this up and sort of with some thoughts about some of the themes that ran through our discussion today. So one of the things Constance reminds us is that ethics are not an event, but a process that continues beyond a research envelope. And that boundaries really shouldn't be defined or should be defined by a community. And that those boundaries consist of a really continuous process of relationship making. And that in fact, relationships rightfully outlive research findings. Cliff reminds us that as an Indigenous person, doing meaningful work with communities activates a sort of different kind and form of accountability to a different kind of relationship. Gabriela reminds us that change is really the only constant, and that terms and categories are not immutable, and history, in fact, still speaks to the present. Rick very valuably reminds us that paradigm shifts are really worth working for, even if they are an uphill battle, and that finding like minds is important. And even Zoom can enable important beginnings and foundations of an emerging community of practice. So in this particular emerging community of practice, I would just like to say a very, very heartfelt thank you to all of you and to everyone who has attended, and to pass it back to Oliver for just a final word from the students.
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Sorry. Yes, okay. Well, it's been an honor and a pleasure to learn from our distinguished speakers tonight. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank them all for taking the time to share with us and take part in the panel. We would also like to thank our moderator, Tanya, for directing the discussion so expertly. And we're also grateful to everyone in the audience for attending and contributing to our first event of the academic year with some excellent questions. And we are very sorry for those questions we couldn't cover, but we've learned from last year where our events went way over time that it's really best to stick to our time limit and keep that thirst for more events for the future. Please keep an eye out on our website and YouTube channel to watch and share the recording of today's event. We hope to see you all at our next event, which is titled Criminal Justice and Indigeneity, Perspectives from India, Australia, and New Zealand. That'll be on October 27th at 8 p.m. London time, as well as future events afterwards, which you can catch up on our CRASSH website or on our webpage. And I will be posting those links in the chat. You can also get further involved with our group or give us feedback and suggestions for future events. And you can do that by writing to our emails, which will also be in the chat. So thank you once more to everyone who participated today. Thank you very much to our distinguished speakers. It's been a really fantastic learning experience, I think, and I have a whole page of notes to take home and ruminate on. So thank you very much once again, and hopefully see you all at future events.